Hello everybody, we're going to pick up where we left off last time, and that is right near the tail end of Chapter 7. Before I begin to do any work or coding, I'm going to go ahead and version my work. So I'm in the File Explorer right now, and I'm going to navigate to my project folder in the root of the C drive, and I'm going to make a copy of the blog folder and just paste it right back in here. And then rename it so I know what's in there. So I'm going to say Chapter 7 up through page, I think like 99 is where I'm at, somewhere around there. 141, well that's a little bit different, but just as long as you have some sort of a guidepost there so you know where you're working. You should do the same thing if you're not in the habit of versioning your work. Change that habit and start getting into it. Especially as your projects get more complex and you run into problems with them, this gives you that fallback mechanism without having to redo too much. All right, so the thing that where we left off, and I was reviewing the videos from last week, was this section here where we were talking about some of the helpers that are built in and the types of form fields that are generated by those helpers, and you can see some of the ones listed there are pretty common ones. There are complete listings of all the various helpers, whether they're regular form helpers or tag helpers. There's all sorts of categories for these things, and those are listed actually on the Ruby's on Rails website. So you can go there and look at those. And always remember that you can still use standard HTML in these structures too. It doesn't have to be these programmatic structures, but there is a reason for it actually happening. And one of the things that we're going to do here, and I'm not actually going to run this command looking at it, is they show here that if you do have your web server up and running, and you pushed into it a certain piece of information, what would actually come back from the web server, and then this would actually list in the web server log, and that's really kind of an important piece here, is the fact that whenever you see a transaction begin, that means it's trying to connect to the database, and when you see roll back, that means for whatever reason they can't push it into the database. Just some syntax error, fields don't match up, there's some sort of an error. But the point of that particular thing isn't whether it works or not. The point is that you're aware of the fact that when you are pushing stuff from your forms into your application, including your database, that a log is kept in the server log. So when the web server is running, that will keep track of every transaction, errors, successes, the whole bit. And one of the reasons why a lot of admins choose to actually write those server logs to a file is so that they can review them. How useful that is? Well, it's useful if you run into a problem and you're trying to decipher what's actually going on. Now, hopefully you have your application built so that you don't get errors, but it does show you that if you do have errors, that you can read them up from the logs and figure out what's going on. All right, so I think that I am going to go ahead and bring the web server up and running. And I was a little preemptive before I started, and I opened up two prompt windows. And with one of them, I'm going to navigate to my projects folder, to the blog that we are working on. And then I'm going to go ahead and launch Rails. So we're going to get the application running so it's retrievable in a browser. And that little stipulation that I just mentioned to you is something we're about to test, most notably with the little snippet you see right at the bottom of page 143 there. All right, so now you see that the server is up and running on port 3000. And of course, if I do the localhost 3000 thing, it is going to load up our application. First launch is always a little slow. But there it is. This lists all the different articles that I do have available right now. Let me probably zoom out a little bit here to try to get some of this stuff on the screen. So this is my native resolution for the display here, so you can see a whole lot more of it all at once. All right. What they would like us to try in the book, though, is to actually try this exact URL. And you can actually click on this link in your PDF and it will launch that, or if you wish to type it. But the whole point is that the parameters that we're running here, and if you look at them really carefully, these are in the form of a get, right? So it says articles. The question mark shows that we're sending the stuff from the page to the server in the form of a get. So the parameters that you're passing are plain text right in the URL. Now, I did type this in and press enter, and I didn't get an error message. But what it's really looking for is title equals Rails, body equals great. I'm not sure if I have anything that's going to really meet that test, but what really is the key is to go ahead and look at the parameters that are being thrown through the web server. So this is where we started out. So where it says Control-C to stop, that was the last message the web server put out. Now notice that when I put in that URL and just launched the server running, right? And notice right here, this little character right here. Notice how that's just a single forward slash. That means the root of our application. And what happened? So it goes through and it pulls in information in the form of a query from the database, and then loads up all the articles and puts them up on the screen. It shows you how long it took. It took, in my mind, a little bit too long, but even shows you what embedded Ruby files were used to generate the look. What layout are you looking at? See where my pointer is right now. It shows you it's rendering articles index HTML ERB within layouts application. So it gives you all the details you really need to kind of decipher the application. When we put in this URL, where the get is in the form of a traditional get, where you see the key value pairs as plain text, it is basically trying to show you what it can, but it's really not succeeding. The parameters that we're passing, and notice how it recognizes them as parameters: title, Rails, body, great. Are we really pulling anything back here? You tell me. Well, we're putting something on the screen, obviously, right? I mean, let's hit the server again with that same URL and watch the output. Is it identical? Sure looks identical. What are we bringing in? Anything? Okay, now you have to start to realize the point isn't to pull anything back. The point is to see what that output message is and how those parameters are being read in particular. If I did put in, let's say, articles, and okay, so we can use the ID number 1, right? Because we know that that will bring something back. Let's take a look at the web server now and look at the output from that. Notice how it's recognizing that ID as a parameter, right? And then it knows how to deal with it, and it knows which application layout to pull up. Now there's something going on here where maybe if I went, back, right? And maybe instead of if the title was Rails, maybe I could actually put in something that actually is there, like whatever, right? Because I see one, and the body says yada. Does that give me anything else? Well, the truth is, does it really match up? Maybe if I just put in the title, let's try that. There's something about it that's not translating, right? It's not this engine. Really, the point here is it recognizes it as a parameter because it's in the form of a get, but the engine is not responding to it. At the same time, it's not halting in its tracks like you might expect. It's not throwing like a grand error message up on the screen. It's just not finding exactly what it's looking for in a fashion that it wants it. All right, so that's kind of the point of that little demonstration. It's not really to show you whether it works or not. All right, the other thing that they're having us look at here is they want us to go to App Controllers, Articles Controller, RB. So I've got my Notepad++ here, but it looks like I closed all my documents from last time. So they want us to go to App Controllers, Article Controllers. I'm just going to drag and drop it right in. And then what they want us to do is look at the create method that sits inside here, if I can find it. Or are they having us actually create the create method? No, there it is. Okay. Okay, so one of the things that they have set up inside the structure here is kind of like a series of commands that are really testing to see if things are working correctly. So if you are pulling in a new article based on parameters that you're feeding in, it's going to attempt to save the article. That's where the if statement responds. And if it succeeds, it will tell you article was successfully created. And then in the format of JSON, notice what command it's going to trigger here. It's going to trigger the show command, and that'll hopefully put the article up on the screen so that you can see it. If it does not work, then it triggers some errors. We're going to talk about that soon, mostly in, I think, the next chapter, honestly. And then also triggers this little entity here which says unprocessable. But the whole point is to have a format in place to handle situations when they arrive. So whether something works or not, that you have some sort of a contingency in place if things are working. So that is kind of the point of that little demonstration. All right. Now, if you look a little bit farther down here, way at the bottom, they have this little method here called article parameters. And notice how they have some things built into it. Some of it is very easy to understand, I think, you know, and if you're not finding it that way, well, here I am to help explain it to you. First of all, that the parameters that we're passing, some are required, okay? So what is required here? That we actually have an article to work with is really what that's saying. We are also permitting parameters of title, location, excerpt, body, and published at, ones that we can change. Ones that are not included in this list are the ones that are automatically generated by the system. So ID, right? Not that we couldn't change that, but really you don't want the user changing that. And the created and last edited dates that are automatically time-stamped into it. Okay, so hopefully that's clear for you. Another thing that's kind of fascinating is if you look at this file here. So app views articles show, so let's get there, app views articles show. You'll notice right up here at the top we have this field that has an ID of notice, and you'll notice that inside of that field called notice there's a little embedded code here whose job it is to bring back any notification messages that you might generate from your code. So for example, in the articles controller, if you successfully create an article, notice becomes this message that we see here. And that message then gets interjected into the output of this template file. So whatever we set that to, that will read that value and push it back to the screen. So it will show us what happened, right?
I'm surprised that there it says ID and in the book it says class.
Is it, does it really? Oh, how do you like that? Yeah, in the book they say class, and here it says ID. Well, apparently things have changed, right? So that's how I'm reading that, Robert. Interesting, though. It's a good catch. Yeah, there's a little bit of a disparity there.
Yeah.
Now, the truth is, does it matter? I think ID is a better choice, probably.
So ID is kind of an HTML keyword. Right?
It is. It is. That's an HTML attribute.
Yeah.
So by giving, and that's a trick that we use when we take any sort of an HTML structure, and usually we give it an ID by rule, you know, that's kind of like the approach we use. And often we'll use a div or you know, I guess a paragraph is generic enough, but usually a div is used, and that way you can style it any way you want. But then we just create an empty object with a name, and then we can inject content into it, and that's kind of just a technique that we use for dynamic web design, whether it's JavaScript or any server-side code. So, yeah, that's a good catch, though, that that's a class where ours is an ID. Interesting.
It's disturbing that the different versions things change.
Yeah, and they do evolve over time, right? Which shows you that languages aren't always well thought out to begin with, or they come up with better ways, and the world around the language changes, so they adjust as they go. Now, why the change, I don't know.
So it sounds true then, like if you had a program written, you can have to concentrate. With each version, you have to make changes.
That's if you change the version you're building your code on. Yeah, that's true. So if you're updating the code engine,
You just can keep the old.
yeah. The general rule of thumb is if it works, don't mess with it too much. Sometimes you change versions, though, because of security issues, because things are hacked. But usually you can adjust your application to kind of work around things. But it is interesting, isn't it? All right. So one of the things that they're showing us here as well are some of the ways that they're displaying the error messages in the templates. So when they are basically putting in those like red highlights that they show in the book, they're using this code right here, and they're keeping it generic. Notice how this is set up. It just says class field with errors, and then when you look at you know, for article title, well, it will basically append that class declaration to it, and that's what gives it that red highlight.
This is something I couldn't get to work.
This is what you couldn't get to work?
Yeah, I mean, I had errors and got these red highlights. So then if I looked in the log, I could never see this field with errors.
Okay. So I think probably the only way to really make it create an error is to do a little bit of interaction here, and
Where do you create articles without any fields? It should be errors, right?
yeah, you should.
And you-
Yeah, and you should get it like that.
But I could see nowhere this field with errors.
Oh, you're saying in the output you're not seeing it.
Well,
So-
I'm not sure where you're supposed to see it.
Well, where you're going to see it is is here. So, for example, all right, let's figure out. Okay, so this little piece was generated, right? And then the title. All right, so I mean, I suppose in other ways you can do the inspect thing, but sometimes just the view source. This is the code. All right, so we should probably make a good differentiation between those two things. View source. Okay, so I should be by the microphone when I say it. So when you look at view source, this is the code that the server sent to your browser.
And produces the screen that you're looking at, right?
It's responsible for producing the screen. However, that doesn't mean that that's the code that ends up in the browser. So this is kind of a weird thing, okay?
In this case, it doesn't seem to be, right?
Right, because here's what's happening. If you look, all right, if you do the same page and you do an inspect element, right? And you'll see it'll actually find the piece I right-clicked on, and you'll notice, right? Notice right here where my mouse is hovering, how it shows you the code that's in the book, right? But this code is a result of scripts running in the background. So the code that's in the inspect view is rendered code following client-side code execution. So I want you to understand that real clearly. If I look here, and I follow the same structure, right? So I have a table, right? And then it goes through and it lists. It looks like it's just listing all of my articles again, to me.
Yeah. This kind of looks like should have happened if these articles at the top there, and if that really had executed.
Correct.
Then you get your list of articles.
Right, but what's actually happening is it runs the code, and then the client realizes there's a mistake, so then it triggers the error code, and it's this code, the inspect code, the stuff that you see in inspect element, that's the code that's actually hitting the browser to generate that view.
How did you get this?
Oh, I'm sorry. If you've never done this before, so usually when you do view source, you just right-click and view page source, right? That's the one I did before. But if you come in here and you right-click, and here's where you don't want to be in a white space, you actually want to be right on the piece that you want to look at. So if I wanted to look at title, I'd right-click on title and choose inspect, or inspect element. And then it brings up this view. Yeah, and you see field with errors, and this is rendered code. What's even more fascinating, if you really want to start digging deep on it, you could click on the console view up here, and you can start to see what JavaScript files are loading. So, and it's not throwing any errors, so it seems to be working okay. Yeah, and I'm not really seeing any like major issues here, but this is the result of rendered code, which happens after the code executes in the browser. Whereas the view source is the code that's actually being sent to the browser. But you got to remember, all these scripts up here, and there's lots of them, are executing in the background. So this is the code we're sending, but whether or not it's coming back that way, I mean, clearly it's not. This looks as if, if we were looking at this, right? So if I did a right-click view source on this, I would have, that's what we're looking at. Isn't that fascinating, though? Yeah. But that's a really good tip, and I know you guys are supposed to learn that stuff in like Web 1 and Web 2, right? So that's where you're supposed to learn that. But you don't really see it until you start working with JavaScript a lot. Because JavaScript can rewrite what's in your browser even after you send it code. So I can send it a page and then tell it to get rid of all that stuff and put this up there instead. And that's kind of what's happening here. So fascinating distinction, isn't it? All right, so that's the difference between view source and inspect element, folks. Articles, and not in the whole page, but a partial form. So that's where that piece is. So if you want to actually look at the code that does that, I mean, we're kind of already doing that, but it doesn't hurt to put it into your text editor and take a look at it there. And then you see that method or that conditional statement. And remember, this is an embedded Ruby file, so we're intermingling our Ruby with our standard HTML. But it runs off of this particular method. And you see the syntax of it, right? If article.errors.any question mark, so are there any errors is really kind of how I read that. And if there are, then this method, or this if statement, actually it's not even a method, triggers as true, therefore wrapping a div around it that has an ID that has CSS attached to it that makes it colored that way. Now what's fascinating is if you go and you look at the the server logs here. So for example, here are some of the error statements. You notice these little spots when there's just a question mark. Well, what the heck is that? Well, that's like a special hidden character, but in terms of us, are we actually putting that in there? No, absolutely not. And where the heck is this authenticity token coming from? Well, that's embedded into the application. And if you were to actually look at your page source here, you're going to notice that there is this little token here that gets created with your session that keeps track of you. And that's done by the Rails engine. So that ends up in there as well. But I think it's fascinating when you look at the output from the server, especially when things aren't working right. So, you know, it's trying to do the transaction. It can't do it because it doesn't have all the right stuff. And then it renders on that new view, see new HTML ERB, it brings in the form partial, it applies the CSS to it, and then it renders what we see. In very much the same way, and I think we kind of already looked at this by virtue of looking at the create, they have actions related to update and edit as just like they do create. So if you succeed, you get a success message, pumps into the error field. If it doesn't, then we trigger this little method here, which attaches those error messages by virtue of that form partial. So as it's rendering, it figures out which state it's in and then triggers the appropriate one depending on what you're doing. If you do this correctly, of course, you know, you're not going to get any error messages. But if you want to experiment, you could take one of those articles, and maybe I can use my just a test and do an edit, because that's the one they're demonstrating in the book right now. I think it's fascinating that they have a little progress bar up there. It's kind of an interesting little feature of this platform. I didn't code that in, it just comes with. Sure is taking its sweet time, isn't it? Now what's fun with that, of course, is I can watch in the background what it's trying to do. And boy, is it going slow. It's about as slow as I would think something would go. Considering it's on a local server, it's not even going over the internet. But we do know, I mean, that's not really a complete listing either. I don't have a published at date, I don't have location or an excerpt or anything like that. So I'm curious to see what's about to happen here. What happened? Nothing. It didn't even let me do it. I'm wondering if I clicked on a different one. Let's say I clicked on this one. And okay, I just pressed escape to cancel. So I'm just going to actually click on show. Let's see if we can get the article to show. Or did we have some sort of a crash here? All right, so here's what I'm going to do, folks. I'm going to actually press escape here. I'm going to close my browser window, stop the server, and restart it. Shouldn't really have to be the case, but yeah, I think I might have done something in there that messed it up.
Well, I think you might have the same problem that I originally had. You get the third error message that says the user must exist.
Yes. Yes.
Maybe that's causing the other issue.
I think that's exactly what's happening, because I recall from last year, Robert, that if we have a little stipulation in our records now that every article has to be attributed to a user that actually exists, right? So maybe I'm clicking on articles that have no associated user. So you know what? That's an excellent point. Let's let's do this. Let's bring up the SQLite browser. Yes, I could do it from a prompt, but why? That's kind of my thinking here. Let's attach to the database. Let's go to our articles tables. Well, and how do you like that? Of course. The only two that have users attributed to them are these here. Yeah, didn't I? So, but then I tried one of the other ones. I think I tried this one, and that didn't work either. So I'm just wondering if I had like an issue in the background. But let's go to the user table really quick and see what the valid user IDs are. So it's either 1 or 2. So I'm going to go back to articles, and I'm just going to like manually like just enter values here. It's not really random. I'm just alternating them, sort of. Right, now that I've done that, I want to make sure that I write those changes. And right here, so up here at the top. See that? That will actually write it to the database. Until you hit that, it doesn't actually write. Do we need excerpts and locations? Do we need a publish that date? Maybe, right? It's going to write some changes in there. All right, now let's go back and try to run the application again. So I'm at the prompt. Got to go down to the root, go into the project folder, run the Rails server. All right, seemed to launch faster this time. And let's go to the browser and bring up the application. And watch the server log, right? Now let's see if we can go in there and click on edit. Okay, so I'm not sure what happened before, but I had an anticipation something went wrong. And, you know, I should be able at this point, you know, add a whole bunch of additional nonsense, right? And then hopefully update the article. Now if I go back and let's say I want to just create a new article, you know, notice that how on earth is it going to know? And we should test this, right? Well, first of all, let's not put anything in. So the highlighting is working, okay? But let's go ahead and put in a title. I'm just going to call it junk entry. And we're just going to put more junk in it and create it, right? So now I'm getting the error that the user must exist. Okay, well, I have a problem. I have no way to log in, right? How can I create an article if I'm not a user who's logged in? And then really what this is pointing out is this is where we're going.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to have to like, you know, like manually put in user IDs. There's no way to put a user ID in. The only logical explanation here would be you create a login system and then it knows which user you are. So then when you hit new article, it knows who you are, right? Yeah. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop that. If you want to look at the background, of course. I'm going to leave the server running for now because my feeling is maybe it'll be fine. But if not, you see how I had to stop it and start it again to try to solve the problem? And I'm not sure exactly what triggered the problem. I think the fact that I tried to do an edit without a user ID there and we didn't have a stipulation in place to handle that error. So it gets stuck in a state of limbo.
So you don't try and fix it?
No, not yet. Because the fix is to let you log in.
Yeah.
That's the fix.
I found a way around it.
Well, that's good. If you found a way to work around it, that's fantastic. All right. All right. So I think that kind of covers that whole piece. The other thing that they're trying to point out here is this whole fact that we're working with partials and pieces, and this whole thing here where it says render form, and whatever, what it's doing in that spot whenever we're calling that command in is it's basically calling in the form partial. That's what it's doing. So instead of putting in the code for the form again, we've already created the form code. It exists in the form partial, the one that starts with an underscore. And when we say render form, it goes out there, it finds the form and drops it in. So that's the advantage of having the partial, is we don't have to individually code it again. Because the truth is, if we're creating a new article, or if we're editing or updating, right, it's the same form. And that's what they're really trying to demonstrate here. Regardless of whether you're doing new or editing, you're still pulling in that form. So this command here that I'm highlighting is really pulling in this file that I have highlighted in my File Explorer right now. And all we have to do is refer to it by name. So this is render form, it finds it, pulls it in, and drops it in. The one thing I do want to point out, though, that I noticed again this year, see where I have this highlight here? This shouldn't say users, it should say articles. Right. But that's the role of that particular little piece. You can also, if you want, in those little render statements, you can actually pass some variables if you want, which are demonstrating right here. And not only can you assign variables, but you can also render partial objects as well. So in this case, notice like you can actually render an article that's in memory if you wish. So it's kind of a flexible little command. If you have a whole bunch of articles maybe you wanted to render, you can actually just loop through and, according to whatever criteria you set, in this case it would just show all of them. But if you had other criteria, you could add that to the mix as well. That basically wraps up Chapter 7, so I'm going to stop this video here. We'll take a short break in class, back up our work, and move on to Chapter 8.